Well, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Is this Michael Jackson headset working okay? I haven't used one of these before, so thanks for braving the snow. It's not that bad. It's not even icy out. So I'm glad you all could come. This is the last in this season's Past to Present lecture series, so I'm really glad you could join us today to talk about disasters at sea. Trigger warning for anybody if you were expecting a happy, uplifting presentation. That would be the other room. Please take a minute to leave now. So let me ask you all a rhetorical question. Does anyone know where the love of God goes when the waves turn the minutes to hours? And how in the world did a 6.5 minute long ballad become a top, #2 radio hit for 40 weeks on the charts? A ballad about a shipwreck. Gordon Lightfoot's wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald lyrics struck a chord with tens of millions of listeners because we can all relate viscerally to this idea of just being in terror at sea, facing disaster. And we know that over the millennia, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of men and women and children and countless vessels of every size and type that have ever sailed seas, lakes, and rivers in the world have asked that same question in their own words and their own language as they endured the horror of shipwrecks and the desperate struggle to survive before finally succumbing to their watery graves. Many of you saw the movie The Perfect Storm, and you remember Mark Wahlberg's character as he slipped free of the capsized fishing vessel Andrea Gale. And he's alone, adrift in these massive seas, and the camera pans away and gets further and further, revealing that he's just an infinitesimal speck in a vast ocean. And at that moment, he has absolutely no hope of survival or rescue. And that image grips all of us, especially when we realize how many countless individuals have met that very fate over the centuries. So this morning, I'm going to go over a variety of disasters at sea, some you've heard of and some you haven't. Long before the Edmund Fitzgerald in 1913, over 4 days from November 7 to 10, a blizzard on the Great Lakes with hurricane-force winds destroyed 19 ships on 4 out of the 5 Great Lakes, killing over 250 passengers and crew. 8 years earlier, 27 ships were lost in the big blow of 1905. At left, you see a contemporary photo of the early 1800s ship on the Great Lakes in a winter storm. On the top right is the overturned hull of the Charles S. Price, 504 feet, sunk with all hands during the 1913 storm. And at the bottom are dead from the Wexford, also lost with all hands, and its cargo of 96,000 bushels of wheat. Some confusion was caused when survivors, identified as crew of the Price, were found wearing life jackets from the Regina, another ship lost with all hands. It was theorized that perhaps the Regina had come along to aid the Price and thrown life jackets and then foundered. However, there was a simpler explanation. Some bodies of Price crewmen ended up with Regina jackets because locals were looting the bodies. And when the sheriff got there and threatened them with legal action and they had to put everything back, some of the life jackets ended up with the wrong bodies. Here's a contemporary newspaper article. As a little side note, you see the subheader, Wilson ready to aid rebels. So this is 1913. Anybody have any idea about what that might have been about? So Woodrow Wilson was supporting the rebels who were trying to overthrow the Mexican president, Huertas. So just a little tidbit of time. In 1987, recreational divers found the Regina. And in it, among thousands of other artifacts, were hundreds of still sealed, unopened bottles of whiskey and champagne. And the head of the dive company that recovered them actually served some of that champagne at his daughter's wedding the next year. And supposedly it was still drinkable. Going back even further, the first documented loss of a Western ship in the Great Lakes was in 1679. Then the French bark Le Griffon carrying a crew of 6 and a full load of furs purchased from Native Americans, disappeared without a trace after it left Green Bay for Niagara, where it was built. Knowing all of this, it's been amusing to me over the years when people ask me, upon learning I was stationed on the Great Lakes twice, why is the Coast Guard on the Great Lakes? It's just a lake. Sometimes weather combines with other factors to cause disaster. On October 4, 1744, a British fleet led by HMS Victory, carrying the flag of Admiral John Bouchan, encountered a ferocious storm in the western approaches of the English Channel. The fleet was dispersed, and all the ships arrived in port safely except Victory, which disappeared with virtually no trace. No survivors from among 1,100 crew on that large warship. There is speculation that a lighthouse keeper had been negligent and poor navigation by the admiral and the ship's captain. But 250 years later, the vessel wreck was discovered in deep water, proving it had not actually run up on a reef, but had foundered in the storm. And research today assigns the fault to defects in the construction. Victory's construction overlapped with a succession of moderate winters between 1730 and 1740, which made the seasoning of cut timbers very difficult. Those winters were mild and almost frost-free, and thus cut timber contained more sap than usual, which made the time required for seasoning longer, and wood simply started to rot instead of seasoning properly. Additionally, they had encountered shortages of good wood, as they basically had denuded the forests in England. So, because it was weakened from this faulty timber, Victory was the only ship in the fleet that didn't endure the storm. I'm not going to talk about combat losses of ships, but there are wartime losses, non-combat related, that are worth reviewing. In October 1944, while the U.S. invasion of the Japanese-held Philippines was ongoing, Admiral Halsey moved his Third Fleet to the east, out of the range of Japanese airplanes, so they could refuel and resupply. Due to imprecise meteorological forecasting and information available in that part of the Pacific, Admiral Halsey's meteorologist incorrectly forecast the movement of a large typhoon. As a result, Halsey steamed much of his fleet directly into it. A number of ships were beset by 60-foot waves and winds of 145 knots. In the resulting calamity, 3 destroyers capsized and sank with all hands. 790 sailors were killed. Several ships were heavily damaged. 146 airplanes on aircraft carriers were destroyed when they broke loose and slid across the decks. A few months later, Fleet Admiral Nimitz released an after-action report which made the following observations of occurrences during the typhoon. Ships not merely rolling, but heeled over continually by the force of the wind, leaving them very little margin to roll further to leeward. Several surviving destroyers reported rolling 70 degrees or more, and we can only surmise how close this was to capsizing completely. Water being taken in quantity through ventilators, blower intakes, and every topside opening. Switchboards and electrical machinery of all kinds shorting and drowning out with fires. Free water up to 2 or 3 feet over engines or fire room floor plates, and in many other compartments coming from above with no evidence of seams coming apart. The loss of steering control, failure of power and lighting, loss of main propulsion, loss of radar and radios, planes on aircraft carriers going adrift, crashing into each other and starting fires, wind velocities and seas that carried away masts, stacks, boats, davits, and deck structures generally, and made it impossible for men to get on deck and secure gear or bring heavy gear, cast heavy gear off. Maneuvering up to the time of sinking in the attempt to main station by all ships that were lost. In other words, the ship's captains were adhering so tightly to naval discipline, even in the typhoon, attempting to maintain station when they should have just tried to save their ship. Testimony that the ships that were lost took a long roll to leeward, varying from 50 to 80 degrees, hung there for a while, and then went completely over, floating a short time before going down. At left is the USS Pittsburgh, a heavy cruiser. The entire bow, 104 feet of bow, was ripped off. It was towed to Guam and repaired, but not until the war ended. And at right is an aircraft carrier, so as you can see, the flight deck is completely smashed. Certainly a significant cause of the extent of these disasters was the rudimentary weather forecasting available at the time, as well as slow communications to ships to warn of weather. One would think that with the availability of real-time weather information and sophisticated prediction models, there's little danger today of modern ships being lost with all hands in terrible weather. Sadly, that's not the case, and ships disappear at sea with astonishing regularity, even today. October 1, 2015, the U.S. flagged and crewed cargo ship El Faro, steaming from Jacksonville to San Juan, Puerto Rico, with a full load of containers and roll-on, roll-off vehicles, sailed into the path of Hurricane Joaquin, foundered and sank with the loss of all 33 crew. These photos, taken from a remotely operated vehicle, show El Faro on the bottom. And at bottom left, the voyage data recorder, VDR, which was recovered in 15,000 feet of water by an ROV and was of immeasurable help in conducting the multiple accident investigations into what happened. Next, this National Transportation Safety Board video provides an excellent executive summary of this completely avoidable tragedy.
The 40-year-old U.S.-flagged steam-powered cargo ship El Faro was owned by Tote Maritime Puerto Rico and operated by Tote Services Incorporated. The vessel was engaged in weekly service between Jacksonville, Florida and San Juan, Puerto Rico, and typically followed a course traveling to the east to the Bahama Islands. The vessel sank on October 1, 2015 in Hurricane Joaquin, a Category 3 hurricane. At 9:48 Eastern Daylight Time on the evening of September 29th, El Faro departed Jacksonville loaded with containers and vehicles. The ship was bound for San Juan with a crew of 33. 2 days before El Faro left on the accident voyage, the storm that became Hurricane Joaquin was a tropical depression about 360 nautical miles northeast of San Salvador Island, Bahamas. The system was upgraded to Tropical Storm Joaquin at 10:36 the evening of September 28th. Hurricane Joaquin was consistently predicted to move southwest, then turn north. But the storm continued to move in a more southerly direction. Its intensity grew to a higher level and faster than predicted. On August 8, 2016, about 10 months after the vessel sank, El Faro's voyage data recorder, or VDR, was recovered. It lay under more than 15,000 feet of water. The VDR recorded the last 26 hours of conversation on the bridge, as well as vessel operating data. The VDR recording began at 5:36 in the morning on September 30th. The vessel was traveling at about 20 knots. Just after 6 a.m. on September 30th, a Bon Voyage System, or BVS weather package, was downloaded on a computer in the captain's office. The BVS weather package had been sent about 1 hour earlier. BVS is a desktop application provided by a private company, Applied Weather Technology. The BVS package showed the predicted storm track, weather, and sea state information in graphic form. BVS tropical cyclone position and intensity information sent to El Faro during the accident voyage was typically 6 hours behind the current National Hurricane Center information. According to the BVS package sent at 5 a.m., storm winds were 55 knots sustained. Aboard El Faro, BVS weather packages were sent only to the captain's email address, but he could forward them to a computer on the bridge where the information would have been available to other crew members. After reviewing the 5 a.m. BVS weather information with the chief mate, the captain ordered a course change of 10 degrees to the south to put distance between the ship and the approaching storm. About 15 minutes later, El Faro received the National Hurricane Center storm advisory on the SAT-C printer on the bridge. This unscheduled advisory contained a minor correction to the normally scheduled advisory that had been sent about 2 hours before. SAT-C is an automated satellite system that transmits weather advisories to vessels of all types. SAT-C data is only provided in a text format. This report indicated similar intensities to the 5 a.m. BVS package. Sustained winds were 60 knots, gusting to 75 knots. Throughout this presentation, the position of the storm will be interpolated along each predicted BVS or SAT-C track in order to show where the storm would have been expected to be at any specific time. The position of the storm along the National Hurricane Center's best track, or actual track, will be shown in black. This storm track was calculated after the accident. The National Hurricane Center identified the storm as a hurricane at 7:39 a.m. on September 30th. It was then centered about 135 nautical miles east-northeast of San Salvador Island. During the noon to 4 watch on September 30th, the VDR recorded Coast Guard aircraft broadcasting 2 warnings to mariners about the hurricane. Later that afternoon, after hearing several discussions about the weather, the helmsman asked the captain if he was going to turn around. The captain said no. Just before 5 p.m., the ship received a SAT-C weather report that sustained winds had increased to 75 knots, gusting to 90 knots. The BVS weather package sent to the captain's email address at 5 p.m. and downloaded about an hour later showed slightly less intense conditions. About 7 p.m., the captain ordered a course change of 10 degrees farther to the south to put more distance between the ship and the storm. The vessel's track would shift to pass between San Salvador Island and Rum Cay, and then turn to pass to the north of Samana Cay. After 7:57 p.m. on September 30th, the captain left the bridge and was not heard again on the VDR recording until 4:09 the next morning. Just before 11 p.m., the bridge received a SAT-C advisory that the storm's sustained winds were 100 knots, gusting to 120 knots. Joaquin was now a Category 3 hurricane. At 11 p.m., a BVS weather package was sent to the captain's computer. It was not downloaded until 4:45 the next morning. After reviewing the updated SAT-C weather report at 11 p.m., the third mate called the captain. He told the captain that on its current track, the vessel would meet the storm at 4 o'clock the next morning. The VDR only recorded audio from the bridge and did not capture the captain's side of the conversation. About 10 minutes later, the third mate called the captain back and said they would be 22 miles from the center of the storm at 4 a.m. and suggested altering their course to head south at 2 a.m. However, this suggested course change was not implemented. At the midnight watch turnover, the third mate told the second mate that they were receiving different information from different weather sources. The second mate reviewed the weather forecast and began looking at the charts for a course to avoid the storm. At 1:20 a.m. on October 1st, after hearing a satellite radio report that the storm was strengthening, the second mate called the captain and suggested a course change at 2 a.m. toward Old Bahama Channel, which runs north of Cuba. The captain did not agree with the second mate's suggestion. The second mate said the captain's orders were to run with the original course. This course put them directly into the forecasted path of the hurricane. Throughout the second mate's midnight to 4 watch, the weather deteriorated rapidly. The ship began listing to starboard because of the strong winds on the port side, and the vessel was losing speed as it approached the outer bands of the storm. Due to the starboard list and worsening conditions, seawater entered into the partially enclosed second deck of the cargo area through cargo loading and other openings in the hull. Toward the end of the watch, the vessel was unable to maintain its heading using the autopilot system because of the wind and the high seas. At 4:09 a.m., the captain returned to the bridge. He and the crew talked about the weather and the loss of ship speed. Despite the worsening weather, the captain said several times that they would be ahead of the storm. He thought they were on the better side of it, meaning the less dangerous quadrant. The captain was most likely relying on the BVS graphical weather package sent at 5 p.m. the evening before. He had not downloaded the most recent BVS package. Statements on the bridge indicated that the ship was listing to the starboard side, due in part to the strengthening winds on the port side. About 4:40 a.m., the chief engineer called the bridge and said the starboard list was affecting the oil levels in the sumps of engine room machinery. At 4:45 a.m., the captain downloaded the BVS weather package that had been sent about 11 o'clock the night before. By the time the captain downloaded it, the storm's position and intensity data in the BVS package were 12 hours behind the National Hurricane Center's current information. About the same time, a National Hurricane Center advisory arrived on the bridge via SAT-C. The hurricane was centered about 17 nautical miles north of Samana Cay. Maximum sustained winds were 105 knots, gusting to 130 knots. The chief mate mentioned a list of possibly 18 degrees, while the captain discussed how oil levels in the engine room were affected by the list with the engineer who was aboard to supervise the riding gang. At 5:43, the bridge received a phone call that there was water in the number 3 cargo hold. The crew thought that the water was possibly coming from a small open hatch called a scuttle on the second deck. A minute later, the captain said cars were loose. He was likely referring to cars in the lower level of the number 3 cargo hold. The captain verified that bilge pumps were running to remove the water in 3 hold, and he directed the engineers to pump ballast water from a starboard to a port tank to improve the list. The captain and chief engineer spoke on the phone about the water level rising in the cargo hold and the effects of the list. After speaking to the chief engineer, the captain ordered the ship to be turned to port to put the wind on the starboard side of the vessel and create a port list. As the ship was turned into port, the chief mate reported that the hold was flooded on the starboard side. Within 2 minutes, the ship's significant starboard list shifted to a significant port list. After the ship was listing to the port side, the captain ordered the engineers to stop transferring ballast. The chief mate accessed the scuttle, reporting that water had been knee-deep and pouring over the scuttle, and then closed it. After the turn to port, the crew on the bridge noticed that the ship was losing speed. Shortly after 6 a.m., El Faro lost propulsion, and the vessel could no longer maneuver. At 7:06 a.m., the captain spoke with TOTE's designated person to advise him of the situation. He reported that there was a considerable amount of water in 3 hold. They had lost propulsion due to a loss of lube oil pressure. The list was about 15 degrees, and the weather was ferocious. Afterwards, the captain told the second mate to send a distress message. At 7:15 a.m., the chief mate reported that the chief engineer said a fire main was ruptured, likely meaning that there was a damaged seawater pipe in 3 hold, allowing seawater to rush into the cargo hold. The chief mate reported that cars were floating in the number 3 cargo hold, and a bilge alarm alerted the crew that water began entering another cargo hold. Although the crew had closed the scuttle and were pumping out the space, water was still entering the cargo hold faster than the bilge pumps could remove it. At 7:27 a.m., the captain ordered the emergency signal to be sounded over the general alarm system, and 2 minutes later, the captain ordered the abandoned ship signal to be sounded. The VDR recording ended at 7:39 a.m., while the captain tried to help the helmsman escape the ship's bridge.
So doesn't that video just make you cringe? Nothing but debris and 1 deceased crew member were found of the 33 crew. You know, in hindsight, what was the captain thinking? How do you explain his judgment? In my Coast Guard career, one of my side duties was in aviation safety, and I was an accident investigator, went to a few accident investigation schools. And because most accidents are caused by human factors, rarely just an act of God, we have some concepts that we use to sort of explain, understand behavior that seems inexplicable. There's a concept called strength of an idea. And strength of an idea basically describes a mindset where you're so locked into your plan, and you're going to do it this way, that as you're moving forward and red flags are popping up all around you saying, you know, the circumstances have changed, maybe we should reevaluate, you simply can't see those things because you're locked into your original idea and don't take new information into account. There's another concept that comes into play in a lot of fatal airline crashes called excess deference. And that's where subordinate crew members see something that's wrong, but they don't press their case strongly enough for a variety of reasons. The authoritarian nature of the particular captain, concern about your job. You know, in this particular case, the crew members obviously stated their concerns numerous times, but they were discounted by the captain. The Coast Guard's final action memo on this disaster included the following comments. The loss of the El Faro and all 33 persons aboard was a tragic and preventable accident. While many factors contributed, by far the most prominent was the captain's decision to sail in close proximity to a Cat 3 hurricane. There were multiple opportunities to take alternate, safer routes. There was adequate information available regarding the threat. And there were warnings and recommendation from the mates on successive watches to alter course, but they were all unheeded. There were also numerous failures on part of the owner, Tote Services Incorporated, to fulfill its obligations under the International Safety Management Code, ISM. These included substandard material conditions, failure to provide basic training, failure to conduct lifeboat drills, among others. Most relevant was the company's failure to provide the necessary shoreside support. Specifically, the company deliberately abandoned its longtime practice of assisting masters with heavy weather voyage planning, storm system monitoring, and avoidance. Knowing the company routinely provided service in an area prone to hurricanes during hurricane season, the decision to abandon this crucial support system was irresponsible and inexcusable. And then finally, the Coast Guard also took responsibility for itself. The Coast Guard, after the vessel owner and American Bureau of Shipping, ABS, was the final element in the safety framework responsible for ensuring that minimum standards were met. The Coast Guard is ultimately responsible monitoring the performance of third parties, ABS, that perform delegated functions and guarantee the effectiveness of inspections and surveys. The Coast Guard failed to adequately oversee ABS in this case, and the investigation reveals that the Coast Guard has not sustained the proficiency and policy framework to do so. Okay, the Tricolor and Kariba collision. This summary of events is taken directly from an account by Jim Austin in Professional Mariner magazine. I want to give him credit. At night and in fog on December 14, 2002, the 580-foot Bahamian-flagged container ship Kariba was steaming westward at 16 knots in the English Channel. A half a mile on her starboard quarter, coming up to overtake at 18 knots, was the 627-foot Norwegian-registered car carrier Tricolor. Both vessels observed a radar contact to port at about 5 miles, that of the 455-foot Singapore-registered bulker Clary approaching the shipping lane intersection at a 90-degree angle from the south at 13 knots. And here's a description of that. And I skipped a paragraph where I would have told you that so you know ahead of time, no lives were lost in this disaster. However, if you're an import car fan, you should know that 2,780 Saabs, BMWs, and Volvos were lost in this accident. So, aware of being overtaken to starboard, the Kariba focused its attention on the Clary, which it couldn't see except on radar coming to port. And Kariba, uncertain as to the intentions of Clary, anticipated that Clary would turn to starboard and go astern. Kariba, in this case, had the right of way, and Clary should have given way, either slowed down, turned to starboard, and passed behind. So Kariba held her course and speed. And then finally, perceiving that there was no change from Clary, Kariba came to starboard 10 degrees and then quickly 20 degrees, and then suddenly was staring directly at the Tricolor's lights. She increased her rudder to hard over, but couldn't avoid a collision with Tricolor's port beam. Tricolor quickly capsized and sank. Tricolor had been aware not only that she was overtaking Kariba, but that the Kariba herself was on a collision course with the Clary approaching from port. As soon as Kariba turned suddenly to starboard into Tricolor's path, Tricolor immediately put her rudder to starboard, but to no avail. Proceeding north at 13 knots with both Kariba and Tricolor on radar from starboard, Clary's second officer, who was the only watchstander on the bridge, stated afterwards he intended to make a dramatic turn to starboard to pass behind. But he believed his ability to turn was constrained by the dimensions of the shipping channel, even though there was good water. Soon after he executed his turn to starboard, he heard a radio call, collision, collision, collision. He observed the two radar blips merge on radar. He resumed his normal heading and passed the area without answering the distress call, stating later he thought the vessels had only kissed. After that, he was found to have erased his chart, and at trial he admitted that someone, unknown, had altered the Clary's log to reflect it was clear rather than foggy, and that there were two other men on deck, even though there was only one. Tricolor's 24-man crew was rescued by Kariba and a passing tug. Compounding the emergency, only a few days later, even though the wreck had been clearly marked with buoys and radio broadcast, a cargo ship hit the wreck, and then the next day, another vessel carrying 70,000 tons of gasoline crashed into the wreck. And then finally, 3 weeks later, a salvage tug inadvertently knocked a safety valve off the Tricolor and causing it to release all of its fuel oil. At trial, full responsibility for the collision was assigned to Kariba. Kariba appealed, stating the other two vessels should be apportioned partial responsibility. The circuit court, in its appeal ruling, confirmed that Kariba was at fault regarding violation of Colreg 19D, turning into a vessel abaft the beam, and failure to reduce speed until the danger of collision was over. It also found fault with Tricolor, noting that Tricolor did not slow down but was attempting to overtake Kariba in heavy fog at 18 knots in a heavily trafficked area, even though it knew Kariba was on a collision course with the other northbound vessel. Clary was found to have responsibility in that it violated its bridge manning requirements with only one person on the bridge, and for failure to take avoiding action in time. And finally, the appeals court noted that in the quarter hour leading up to the collision, none of the three vessels sounded its foghorn or communicated with any other vessel on the radio except the last second collision call. At left you see the Kariba's smashed bow, pretty significant collision. And at bottom right are some discount Saabs, BMWs, and Volvos. The Tricolor was dismantled piece by piece and then taken to land And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Winslow Homer's 1889 painting, Gulfstream. Pretty poignant. You can just sort of imagine what the man is thinking. Now, after the Museum of Art in New York purchased the painting and put it on display, Winslow Homer was very annoyed to get lots of letters and questions from people about the fate of the gentleman. And so he wrote a snippy letter to the editor, and he said, quote, "You can tell these ladies that the unfortunate Negro who is now so dazed and parboiled will be rescued and returned home and live happily ever after." This is the MS Estonia, the car ferry built in Germany in 1980. Note how the bow has what's called a visor, which opens to allow vehicles to drive aboard. Estonia left Tallinn, Estonia, en route Stockholm, fully loaded with 989 passengers and crew on September 27, 1994. Conditions in the Baltic Sea were rough, with winds at 35 to 45 knots and seas 15 to 20 feet. Shortly after 1 a.m., heavy wave loads caused the visor to separate from the bow and tilt over the stem. The ramp was pulled fully open, allowing large amounts of water to enter the main car deck. Very rapidly, the ship took on a heavy starboard list. The four main engines lost power. The list to starboard increased. Water entered the accommodation decks, and the ship sank rapidly. 852 passengers and crew died. Most were trapped inside the capsized ship and never had a chance. The picture at left shows one of Estonia's life rafts as seen the next day, and you can see how massive those seas are. And the picture at right is an artist's rendering the Estonia, what she looks like on the floor of the Baltic Sea. So what happened from the investigation? The first sign of trouble was a metallic bang heard around 0100, 1 a.m. An inspection, which was limited to checking for warning lights for the ramp and visor, not a physical inspection, showed there were no problems. And over the next 10 minutes, passengers and crew reported hearing many other loud metallic banging noises. At 1:15, the visor in which the ship's bow door opened separated. The ship immediately took on a heavy starboard list that went quickly to 30 to 40 degrees, and water flooded into the vehicle deck. Estonia was turned to port slowly and slowed before the 4 engines cut out completely. At about 1:20 a.m., a weak voice called "alarm, alarm" over the public address system, followed immediately by an internal alarm for the crew, and then 1 minute later, the general lifeboat alarm. Now, at this point, the ship's already heeled over at about 40 degrees. The vessel's rapid list and flooding prevented many people in the cabins from ascending to the boat deck. A mayday was communicated by the ship's crew at 1:22 a.m., but it didn't follow standard formats. Estonia directed a call to the ship Sila Europa, and only after making contact was the word mayday used. By 1:30 a.m., the ship had rolled 90 degrees, and by 1:50 a.m., it had disappeared from radar. About 650 people are estimated to be still inside the ship when it sank. The investigative commission estimated up to 310 passengers and crew made it to the outer decks, and 160 of those made it to the lifeboats and life rafts, and those who didn't make it to a lifeboat or life raft had no chance. The official report indicated the locks on the bow door had failed from the strain of the waves, and the door separated, opening the ramp. When the door separated, it broke at points which did not trigger the warning lights that are seen on the bridge to indicate an open door. The bridge was also situated so far back on the ferry the visor couldn't be seen. While there's video monitoring of the inner ramp area, the monitor on the bridge did not show that picture. The bow visor was found to be under-designed because the manufacturing and approval processes did not consider the visor to be a critical item for ship safety, as it would the rest of the hull. Hard to believe. The report was also critical of the ship's crew, particularly for failing to reduce speed before investigating the banging noise, and also for delays in sounding the alarm, being passive, and not providing guidance to the passengers on the ship. As a result, in 1999, special training requirements in crowd and crisis management and human behavior were instituted on all passenger ships, and amendments were made to watch-keeping standards. Estonia's distress beacons, or EPIRBs, required manual activation. You had to physically turn them on, and nobody in the crew did that. Had they been activated automatically, an alarm would have been sent immediately. And the location of the ship would have been clear, which wasn't clear for about an hour after the accident. Subsequently, all EPIRBs were required to deploy automatically. And finally, this accident was instrumental in the requirement to mandate voyage data recorders on ships. And as you saw on the El Faro, the voyage data recorder, while it didn't prevent the accident, it at least made it possible to understand what had happened. How many of you know about the Sultana? No hands? No Sultana? This is the steamboat Sultana. Picture taken in April 1865, which, as your history recollections may tell you, was a momentous month in the United States. The account I'm going to read to you is from Brady Dennis, who is a reporter for the Washington Post. He did a great piece on the Sultana a few years ago. The men on this boat had seen all manner of death and despair, witnessed friends shot dead on muddy battlefields, endured dirty, disease-ridden Confederate prison camps. They were tired, injured, sick, and underfed. But in April 1865, they were happy and relieved. Lee had surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. The Civil War was over, and however improbably, they had survived in their prison camps. Months earlier, on Christmas Day, a Union soldier from Ohio named John Ely had sat in his Mississippi prison camp wondering whether he would see home again. "Such a day for us prisoners, hungry, dirty, sleepy, and lousy," he wrote in his journal. "Will another Christmas find us again among friends and loved ones?" Eli was among the more than 2,000 paroled Union prisoners of war, many still teenagers, crowded aboard the steamboat Sultana as it pulled away from the docks at Vicksburg on April 24, headed up the Mississippi River, bound for families, farms, and home. "Oh, this is the brightest day of my life, long to be remembered," Eli wrote before the trip commenced. The brightness would not last. "All these guys were on their way home after going through so much," said historian Alan Huffman. "People were just dying around them for 4 years. You set foot on this boat and you think you're home free, but really, the worst was ahead." For 2 days, the woefully overcrowded boat lurched northward. Melting snow in the north had contributed to one of the worst floods in memory. The Sultana stopped in Memphis on April 26 and continued north later that night. At 2 a.m., 7 miles upriver from Memphis, a boiler exploded. 2 more exploded in rapid succession, visiting yet another hell on men who had already endured so much. Some were killed instantly by the explosion. Others awoke to find themselves flying through the air and didn't know what had happened, Huffman wrote in his book, Sultana, Surviving the Civil War Prison and the Worst Maritime Disaster in American History. One minute they were sleeping, and the next they found themselves struggling to swim in the Mississippi River. Some burned on the boat. The fortunate ones clung to debris or horses and mules that had escaped the boat, hoping to make it to shore, which they couldn't see because it was dark and the river was 5 miles wide because of the flooding. Still others faced a horrible choice: remain with the floating inferno or jump in the river and risk being drowned by the panicked masses in the water below. Making matters worse, many of these soldiers did not know how to swim. "When I came to my senses, I found myself surrounded by wreckage in the midst of smoke and fire," an Ohio soldier recalled. "The agonizing shrieks and groans of the injured and dying were heartrending. The stench of burning flesh was intolerable and beyond my power of description. It was all confusion," remembered one Michigan soldier. "Brave men rushed to and fro in the agony of fear. There were some killed in the explosion, lying in the bottom of the boat, being trampled, while others cried and prayed," recalled another Ohio soldier. "That sight I shall never forget. I often see it in my sleep and wake with a start." The Sultana disaster killed an estimated 1,700 of the passengers, a death toll higher than caused by the Titanic or Lusitania. It remains the worst maritime catastrophe in U.S. history, but was relegated to brief mention in the country's newspapers, overshadowed by the end of the war and the assassination of President Lincoln only 2 weeks earlier. John Wilkes Booth had been tracked down by authorities and killed just the day before, and the Sultana story could not compete with headlines like "Booth Killed." Jerry Potter, author of The Sultana Tragedy, America's Greatest Maritime Disaster, said, "The nation had just finished 4 long bloody years of war. Over 600,000 men had died. People were accustomed, unfortunately, to reading about death, and they were callous toward it. Greed, incompetence, recklessness, and bad luck all played a role in this disaster. The trouble started the moment Sultana docked in Vicksburg. One of its boilers had sprung a leak. The captain brought in a mechanic from New Orleans. The mechanic wanted to replace a ruptured seam. That would take a while and cost time and money. The captain insisted the mechanic simply hastily patch the boiler. The government's offer to pay $5 or more per head for Union POWs meant big money for steamboat captains. It also sowed the seeds of corruption, as boat captains commonly offered kickbacks and other bribes to Army officers willing to load their vessels with as many men as possible. That's part of the reason the Sultana, built to hold 375 passengers, set sail with 2,400. Every corner of the boat was full of weary soldiers sandwiched tightly together. The decks of the 260-foot-long boat sagged and creaked under the load. It was corruption and gross negligence, Potter said, a horrible comedy of errors. Hours after the explosion, Sultana sank to the bottom. Bodies continued to surface downriver for months, and many were never recovered. The captain was among the casualties. There were investigations and tribunals, but ultimately no one was held fully accountable for our worst maritime casualty. Today, many of the dead lie in the Memphis National Cemetery under simple white headstones engraved "Unknown U.S. Soldier." Not all the graves are anonymous. One is marked with the name of John Ely, the Ohio soldier who never saw his next Christmas. I told you this wasn't going to be a happy, uplifting presentation. How many of you know about the Eastland? One hand? Two hands. Okay. I didn't know about the Eastland until I became the captain of the port, Sector Lake, Michigan, based in Milwaukee, and Chicago was a big part of my area responsibility. And then I learned about the Eastland. On the morning of Saturday, July 24, 1915, a light rain fell. The air was filled with anticipation and excitement. The SS Eastland, known as Speed Queen of the Great Lakes, was part of a fleet of 5 excursion boats assigned to take Western Electric employees, families, and friends across Lake Michigan from Chicago to Michigan City, Indiana, for a day of fun and fellowship. More than 7,000 tickets have been purchased for the day-long festivities. Passengers began boarding at 6:30 a.m. for a 7:30 departure. At 6:45, the Eastland began listing to starboard from the mass of gathered passengers on the wharf side of the ship. It straightened momentarily and began listing to port. Orders were placed to put the ship on an even keel with the ballast tanks, and the Eastland was righted. Between 7 and 7:05 a.m., passengers were coming aboard at the rate of 50 per minute. The count reached 1,000. The ship listed to port again. The engines were started. At 7:10 a.m., the Eastland reached her capacity of 2,500 passengers. Boarding stopped. Preparations began to bring the gangplank in. Attempts were made to have the passengers move to starboard to correct the list. Most passengers were busy talking and didn't comply. At 7:15, the list to port worsened. At 7:20, it got 10 to 15 degrees. The captain ordered the engineer to open valves to fill the starboard ballast tanks, but no water came in for about 7 minutes. The Eastland eventually righted, but was unstable. The gangplank was drawn in. The ship began listing more to port, even though most passengers were on the starboard rail. At 7:20, the port list continued. Water began entering the main deck through a scupper on the port side. The engines were ordered stopped. Passenger loading had been completed and preparations continued for departure. At 7:23, passengers on the main deck were instructed to move to the starboard side. The same request was made to passengers immediately abaft the engine room. Water began entering the Eastland through the port gangways. The Modoc whistle warning signal sounded. The captain rang standby on the engine room telegraph. The Eastland began moving away from the wharf, and passengers on the upper decks began drifting away from the starboard rail by the wharf. The port list continued, estimated at 25 to 30 degrees at 7:27 a.m. The stokers and the oilers in the boiler room ran to the main deck, sensing disaster not only from the list, but from the water coming up into the ship. The passengers on the hurricane deck were asked to move to the starboard side, but now the angle was too great, the deck was slippery from the rain, and they couldn't move. At 7:28 a.m., the angle reached 45 degrees. Dishes fell off shelves, the piano on the promenade deck crashed to the port side, the refrigerator behind the bar crashed over, crushing 2 women passengers. Water poured in through portholes in the gangway. The passengers on the main deck panicked, rushed to the staircases leading to the 'tween deck, creating a bottleneck, which was a death trap for most of the passengers. The list of the ship worsened, and passengers and crew jumped off the starboard side. Between 7:28 and 7:30 a.m., the Eastland rolled quietly into the Chicago River and came to rest in the mud and 20 feet of water. 844 children, babies, women, and men died. And you can read that there had been warnings foreshadowing what might happen with this vessel. That's the Chicago River. Helen Ripa, a Western Electric nurse, remembered later, "I shall never be able to forget what I saw. People were struggling in the water, clustered so thickly that they literally covered the surface of the river. A few were swimming, the rest were floundering about, some clinging to a little raft floating free, others clutching at anything they could reach, bits of wood, each other, grabbing each other, pulling each other down, and screaming. The screaming was the most horrible of all." And of course, these people were all dressed up for an outing. Back in 1915, when you went to a picnic, you didn't wear shorts, t-shirts, and a flip-flop. Women wore full dresses with corsets, and the men were wearing coats and jackets and ties. As the crowded ship began listing back and forth, many thought it was a joke initially, but once it listed so far, people began to slide across the deck. Panic began. Not only did most passengers not recognize the impending disaster until too late, the captain also failed to recognize the disaster until too late and failed to sound the alarm until the last second. Because the Eastland capsized so suddenly, no lifeboats or life rafts were launched, nor were any life jackets handed out. And this is the scene later. Over the next several weeks, firefighters, Coast Guard station, and others assisted recovering the victims. Eastland's passengers were not privy to information about defects in the ship. A ship's metacentric height is a measure of its initial stability. After the metacentric height of Eastland was calculated during the engineering phase, they removed 60 feet of length from Eastland, which made it less buoyant, and they added an additional deck, which made it more top-heavy. And no tests were performed by the builders or inspectors to recalculate the metacentric height until years after the disaster. Additionally, multiple modifications had been made, making the ship more top-heavy, adding air conditioning, cement between the upper decks. And finally, and ironically, after the 1912 Titanic disaster, new safety requirements required lifeboats. So 14 tons of lifeboats were added to the upper decks. And of course, that further reduced stability. And finally, while the Eastland had a licensed capacity of 2,500, that number was clearly too great for a ship with these known instability problems. Ted Wachholz, president of the Eastland Disaster Historical Society, has a theory on why the Eastland looms so much smaller in our collective American memory than the Titanic or Lusitania. There wasn't anyone rich or famous aboard, he said. It was all hardworking, salt-of-the-earth immigrant families. And I think there's probably a lot of truth to that. This is a recreation which isn't exactly accurate, but gives a good sense of what happened. Weeks of boredom, hours of sheer terror. All of you know and love our historic lightship Columbia, moored just outside. You might not know how dangerous life on a lightship could be. Survivors of the 5-fathom lightship, which took 4 men to the bottom in 1893, told of how their ship foundered off 5-Fathom Bank, New Jersey, after a succession of mountainous waves pounded the bulwarks, tore off the ventilators, and filled it with water through the resulting deck openings. There were no survivors when the lightship Buffalo, pictured here, foundered in Lake Erie in the 1913 gale I talked about earlier. But a message from its dead captain to his wife told all. Scrawled on a board that washed ashore a few days later after the disaster, the message read simply, "Goodbye, Nellie. Ship is breaking up fast. Williams." When commissioned in 1931, the 130-foot Nantucket lightship LV-117, pictured here, carried the most modern signaling equipment of the time. Her station was 50 miles southeast of Nantucket Island in deep waters in the middle of the transatlantic shipping channel, where it was subject to the very unpredictable and harsh New England seas, winds, and fog. It lay near Nantucket Shoals, an area where the depth of water decreased dramatically and had claimed many ships and lives over the years. From its position, incoming ships would take bearings on Nantucket's radio signal from as far as 300 miles. One night in January 1934, in heavy fog, Nantucket was transmitting radio signals to the ocean liner SS Washington, the largest ocean-going ship ever built in the United States. The coordinates were misjudged by the Washington's lookout, and the monstrous vessel sideswiped the Nantucket, but tragedy was averted and the ship limped back to port for repairs. A few months later, Nantucket lay anchored in 192 feet of water off Nantucket Shoals. Heavy fog engulfed the region. The lightship sounded her foghorn for the incoming 47,000-ton, 900-foot ocean liner Olympic, the sister of the infamous Titanic and Britannic vessels. She was traveling in the heavy fog at 20 knots. RMS Olympic had sailed across the Atlantic uneventfully for 25 years. It was following Nantucket's radio beacon signal with the intent of altering her course when she was close enough to the lightship. The navigator on the Olympic miscalculated the location of the Nantucket and was unable to see the lightship in the fog until she was a mere 500 feet from collision at 20 knots. The crewmen of the Nantucket sounded the alarm, grabbed their life preservers. The Olympic, 75 times the size of the Nantucket, literally ran her over and sliced her in two. She quickly sank. The captain of the Olympic ordered boats put over to save the crew, but 7 of the 11 lightship crewmen drowned in the frigid water. 4 were rescued, including the captain, who died a few months later of his injuries. The British White Star Line, owners of the Olympic, built a new lightship for the Coast Guard as part of an agreed-upon compensation. And here you'll see the captain of the Olympic in uniform and the injured captain of the Coast Guard lightship, who unfortunately died a few months later.
Within a few miles of the American coast, the Olympic, sailing in a dense fog on a course set by the directional radio of the Nantucket, rammed the lightship, which sunk in 30 seconds. 4 of her crew went down with her, and of the 7 picked up, 3 died shortly after being taken on board. The Olympic was undamaged, and flying her ensign at half-mast, she reached New York the following morning.
It all happened so quick that we don't know just how it did happen. We were in the water before we knew it. We most all had our life preservers. Guess that was a means of saving our life.
I'm very sorry it happened, but we did our best. Our boats are away in very quick time, and everything was done to that we could do for them.
I would like to confirm that with the captain says.
So there's the HMS Bounty. And Bounty was a replica ship built by MGM Studios for the 1962 motion picture Mutiny on the Bounty. It sat as a dockside tourist attraction for most of the years until 2001, when the current management company bought it. And as many of you remember, it hits at the bottom of the sea now, as indicated in these pictures here. And since it's 11:30 already, so rather than go through the whole accident investigation, I'm going to summarize, because it's frankly very similar to the El Faro. This is a ship that had a captain that was intent on sailing into a hurricane. Several of the crew members questioned the captain and said, geez, maybe we should stay in port. But they were all very enamored of the captain. They thought they respected him. They thought he was a great leader, a great sailor. They wanted to be part of this. And so they all agreed to stay on the boat as it got underway. But as you see in the previous slide, after 2 days, here's where the Bounty was. And there's Hurricane Sandy. heading up the East Coast before it cut into New York and New Jersey. And that's, you know, if you think about the old the beer commercial, I don't always sail 60-year-old tall ships that have rotting hulls and inadequate equipment and inexperienced crews, but when I do, I sail it right into the teeth of a hurricane. And that's pretty much what happened here, sadly. They battled increasingly worse weather, seas that got up to 30 feet and winds over 90 miles an hour. And the captain made the choice, despite his original stated intent, to sail east and pass east of the storm. He clung to the shore and sailed to the west of the storm as the hurricane started turning in to the northwest towards land. Pumps started failing, engines failed. He's down to one working engine and one bilge pump. That pump fails. They can't get a generator started because the water's 4 foot deep and the electrical equipment, and they'll be electrocuted. The crewmen asked the captain several times if they should call the Coast Guard. No, we're going to be fine. Finally, at about 2 in the morning, the second mate convinces the captain to call the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard launches a C-130. It circles overhead, kind of monitors it. It's talking to it. It says we're going to launch H-60 helicopters from Elizabeth City at daybreak because the weather is just too bad to fly helicopters in the middle of the night in that weather. And then at about 4 a.m., the ship takes a heavy roll, and they're forced to abandon ship. They're able to get a radio call to the C-130 and at least tell them, hey, we're abandoning ship. So now they're all in the water. They last saw the captain and one of the female crew still in the rigging. Several of these crew in the water were trapped in the rigging but cut themselves free. They managed to get half of them into one of the life rafts, and then the others were hanging onto the outside of a life raft. And at daybreak, the Coast Guard helicopters were able to get there and rescue all except for the one female crew member who had last been seen aboard the ship. They found her in her anti-exposure suit about 6 hours later, but she was deceased. And the captain was never seen again. And so really, it's a classic case of those same conditions I talked about with the El Faro, which is strength of an idea. The captain had this idea in his head that he was going to go chase this hurricane, and he was going to be fine because he'd been in heavy weather before. He was a master sailor, and we're going to get through just fine. And the crew had excess of trust in the captain and excess deference to his perceived ability and judgment. And as a result of those human failings, the captain killed himself, killed his one crew member. Thank God the other crew members did survive, but also destroyed this beautiful ship. So I think it's time to lighten things up a bit.
Just telling the story.
Well, come on, George, finish the story.
The sea was angry that day, my friends.
How many of you have seen that before? Remember that one? It's a classic. I'll start it again just to hear him say that at the beginning. It's so fun.
The sea was angry that day, my friends.
I love that. Okay, so if you ever think you're having a bad day, and these are just a few pictures to remind you, well, it could be worse. And the ship at the top left is not a swivel ship. It's not supposed to do that. Argo Merchant. Remember the Argo Merchant? The Argo Merchant was a Liberian flag tanker. Had a checkered past, lots of incidents, lots of groundings. In December of 1976, it loaded up 7.7 million gallons of number 6 fuel oil, set sail off of Nantucket. It was sailing with a broken gyro compass, 2 unqualified crew at the helm, and inadequate charts for the area it was in. It ran aground on Middle Rip Shoal off Nantucket, 24 miles off of its intended course. It broke apart, and its entire 7.7 million gallon cargo was lost. Fortunately, the winds carried the fuel oil offshore, and so the devastation to the environment was not as severe as it might have been in different conditions. So I'll finish with one last little story, a little news clip that's, I could tell a whole story just about this one rescue case, but I'll just let you watch the 2-minute news clip instead. Oh, how many are sailors, like sailboat sailors? All right, so you'll enjoy this video clip. It'll make you feel really good.
At one point, a crewman who's tied himself to the wheel is dragged completely underwater. The Coast Guard never trains for rescues in conditions like these. It's simply too dangerous.
I wanted you to see it again because it's just pretty cool. So that's a 40-foot boat, a 60-foot mast. It looks to me like that waves about 80 feet. They didn't sink yet, though.
Four-man crew determines that their Jayhawk helicopter can reach the boundary Malachite, but only to spend an absolute maximum of 30 minutes on the scene. Even luck and perfect efficiency won't conserve enough fuel to make it back. They'll have to fly on to Bermuda. By the time the rescuers arrive, it's pitch black night.
One of the crewmen remarked to me that when he saw the helicopter out there, it was the most awesome thing that they'd ever seen in his life, because they were in a hurricane, and just out of the blackness appears this helicopter.
The helicopter can't get close enough to the pitching sailboat to drop a rescue basket on the deck, so the boat's 3 crewmen are told to jump into the 40-foot seas. Rescue swimmer Gilbert goes into the water to help the men, one by one, into the basket for hoisting aboard. The job of holding the helicopter steady in the howling winds belongs to the pilot, Lieutenant Commander Bruce Jones.
It's tremendously difficult, hardest thing I've ever done. And for me personally, as aircraft commander who was responsible for their safety, what frightened me was the idea that if it didn't work out, I was responsible for those guys being in the ocean for them else offshore without being rescued.
After the 3 crewmen are pulled to safety, the hoist cable snaps nearly in two as rescue swimmer Yoder is being lifted. However, he does make it aboard. When the chopper arrives safely in Bermuda, the boat's captain says, "There's no question, if you guys didn't show up, we were dead."
Well, all I'll say about that case is the sea was angry that day, my friend. So as I wrap up, I don't want you all to leave thinking that, the sea is this horrible place and you don't ever want to go on a ship because, boy, it's so scary. Or maybe you have kids that are contemplating a career in the merchant marine and now you don't want them to do it. You want them to go be an accountant or something like that. No, it's, the title of the presentation was Disasters at Sea, so I had to talk about disasters at sea. I didn't have any choice. But I want you to know, this is a photograph I took just this morning on marinetraffic.com. Have you guys ever used marine traffic? So if you ever want to know what's out there in the river, you see ships go by and you're curious about them, go to marinetraffic.com and zoom into Astoria, and you can see you can see where the ship is from, where it's going, its history. It's really interesting. But this is a picture taken this morning of all the ships in the world that are transmitting AIS. And as you can see, there are literally tens of thousands of ships underway every minute of every day all over the world. There are millions of voyages every year. And so even though we've talked about disasters for an hour, statistically, it's almost an infinitesimally small number of ship voyages end in disaster. And so, you may want to be a little kind of concerned or gloomy. But I would just say, hey, don't worry. Be happy. Don't worry. Be happy.